Again, and welcome to lesson one. I'm excited to get started on this content with you. Each week, as we go through our studies together, I'll prepare an introduction video that gives you an introduction into the kind of major themes of what we'll be talking about in that particular week. So this week, we're going to jump in and talk about first what's happening in the New World. I put that in quotes because obviously this world, meaning the Americas, was not new, but it was new to many people. It was new to the Europeans who would eventually show up here. In the second video, then, we'll talk a little bit about the Old World, meaning Europe for the most part. Remember that when we talk about American history, we're coming from a very Western mindset. So we'll be talking about what happens in Western civilization, which is primarily European. Finally, I'll end the second video by talking a little bit about the origins of slavery as it develops here in the Americas. So, the New World, meaning the Americas, what's happening here? You can read some of the details in your textbooks, but I do want to point out a couple of things. We won't spend a whole lot of talking about what has happened here in the Americas related to native tribes or civilizations. The first reason for that is how we define history. That's one of your questions for this week, so I'm not going to spend much time talking about it. But as you answer that question, be thinking about why we would not cover things like the Aztecs or the Mayan or the Incan civilizations, why we wouldn't talk about those in this context. But those civilizations had existed. It's important to realize that these were very significant societies. They had large populations. They had great technologies. They had huge cities. They had well-developed forms of government. And they had been very strong civilizations prior to the arrival of the Europeans in the Americas. But for many reasons, these had been on the decline, so that by the time the Europeans arrived in the late 1400s, early 1500s, most of those civilizations had been weakened, if not eliminated, over time. Of course, the arrival of the Europeans further adds to that, due to such things as disease and to some extent warfare, but mostly disease. And again, you'll write about that in your question about the Columbian Exchange. So let's talk a little bit about the varying types of civilizations in the Americas. Well, BC, prior to the year zero, there had been an agricultural revolution in this part of the world, which means that these societies learned how to plant and how to create more stable communities. These civilizations, particularly the Aztecs, the Incans, the Mayans, were able to stay in one place and give up what they had previously done, which was hunting and gathering. And yet other societies continued in that hunting and gathering types of living. So there were tribes, particularly in what is today northeastern and northwestern United States, where they followed the fish and game, moved from place to place. Those societies had learned to work together. They were cooperative societies, very distinct, very loosely connected, and yet certainly connected in their own kinds of tribes, as we would use the word. There were also the agricultural societies in the Pueblos of New Mexico and the Iroquois of the Northeast. Again, as they grew larger, they grew more complex. These were economically and religiously sophisticated societies. And yet when the Europeans show up, it creates a huge power dynamic, and those societies begin to change in many ways. I want to use an example of what's probably a pretty familiar story. It's the story where the American mythology of the first Thanksgiving and also the Pocahontas story come out of. It's what happens in Virginia when the European colonist shows up there. Let's look at the year 1617 in what is today Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. The Native American leader at that time was a chief by the name of Powhatan. He was a leader of a tribe called the Pamunkeys. In his leadership, he had united several clans or tribes under his authority. He called it a confederacy. It numbered nearly 9,000 people, covered a large geographic region, and he was managing or governing that region. Often there were rivalries between the different tribes. Skirmishes would break out over trade, over territorial boundaries, over leadership issues, and these would sometimes break out into conflict. But Powhatan was a sophisticated leader who managed that conflict well and was having a really peaceful period of government until that time, until 1607, when another, quote, tribe shows up. This tribe happened to arrive in boats. They happen to look pretty different. They talk different. They show up with guns. These are the Europeans, of course. Yet Powhatan, as a leader, understood how to manage conflict, change, differing forms of tribes. And so his reaction to them might have been a little different if he had perceived them as enemies. But he didn't. He is very friendly to them. He reaches out, he offers to help. Eventually, the English begin to starve. Powhatan cannot understand why that's the case. Why weren't they growing food? Why aren't they settling in? Even though he doesn't understand it, he offers help. From his perspective, the more he could help them, the more favorable that would be to create peace. Certainly, there were conflicts between these new immigrants and the old settlers who had been there, the natives. The English talked about their king. Powhatan saw himself as a ruler. He had no plans to bow down to this English King James. Certainly, he was tempted to let these troublesome people starve to death, but he chose not to, for his own purposes. Why? He realized that these English speakers could trade with him. They could provide labor. They could give him specifically guns, which would help him with the other tribes in his confederacy. So Powhatan decides to befriend them. He cements the relationship by marrying his daughter, his favorite child, Pocahontas, to a white settler named John Rolfe. Note that she did not marry John Smith, contrary to Disney's interpretation of the story. I love to start with this example to help us understand that the natives had their own societies developing. When we study them, it's important that we don't talk about them as helpless, as if the forces of history acted on them without their own input. Certainly, we know that the story does not turn out well for them, but in 1706, we would not have known that. It's important to recognize that that the natives were not simply acted upon by history. They were actors in history. They were a part of the historical action that's taking place. Sometimes it's hard for us to know their viewpoints because they didn't write it. Written languages were not as important to these societies. And so when we think about what history is, it's sometimes hard to bring those points of view into the story. But because they didn't write it and we don't have the historical record, does not mean that these groups of people were somehow not involved or part of the action or have any efficacy in what was going on. So please keep in mind the complexity of Native American societies as we think about the course of the next 200 years that we'll talk about in the rest of our semester together. I'm going to end there. We'll start again with the second video. Please be sure to watch that where we talk a little bit about the Old World and the development of slavery in the United States.